is a springtime rain, to have a friend right in your corner. Your heart will feel a little warmer. Tender loving care, tender loving care. Each warm and friendly touch lets someone know you care so much. Tender loving care, tender loving care.
Good afternoon. I'm Dr. Greenbrier Almond. Thank you for joining us on our program, Tender Loving Care. It's hard to believe that for about 39 years we've been talking about this interface between Christianity and medicine, and there's always something new. There's another layer. It's like peeling back an onion for me. I used to be challenged by my mother to help her in the kitchen and slice onions, and I would start to cry. But she pointed out to me quite correctly, and my father had a microscope at home, and that you could take one thin layer of skin off of that onion and peel it back, and you would discover something new. And she made it fun to peel onions. But anyway, Dad had a microscope, and we would look at that and see the cells of the onion under the microscope. And something like reading the Bible is something like that for me. I've talked about this topic for some 39 years. I can peel back the onion, that interface, and I always discover something new. One of the things that I'm looking at this summer is the call that God has on all of our lives. It's not just myself as a doctor or other doctors who are certainly called into their profession. In fact, young people ask me now about the field of medicine. Should they go into it, and what's it like? And you know, I try to encourage them, but I also discourage them slightly. I say it's a very hard field to get into. There's certainly a lot of regulation in medicine now. I suspect we occupy more of the news, evening news, talking about medicine and financing of medicine, and repealing Obamacare, repairing Obamacare, you know, on and on and on. It's a very complex field. And if a person didn't feel called to study it for the purpose of healing or being part of a healing profession, then they should certainly go be something else. There are a lot of other fields. Accounting is actually where doctors' children are being sent by their own parents. They say, some parents will say to their children, don't study medicine, go into something else, and they'll suggest accounting. Being a lawyer has always been a good profession, and for much of my 46 years, doctors and lawyers have been at loggerheads, and we've had the malpractice attorneys, and there's been suits against doctors, and so that's a strange thing too. Makes medicine hard, but maybe even being a lawyer would be a good idea. So calling, though, settles the question. If a person feels called, then they know they're in the right direction. One of the things I would advise people to do if they're thinking about calling, besides reading about Paul, and we're going to get into the life of Paul here, would be go back to someone like my father, who wrote Stories of West Virginia Doctor. At the close of his practicing medicine, he retired from medicine at age 75, and he said, well, now it's time to write my memoir. And he wrote some 55 stories that are treasures, and they're about the call to medicine. How else would you imagine someone, if they didn't feel called, going out on a Jeep, unheated Jeep, if you want to say it that way, up rutted roads in Upshur County, and horrible conditions, taking care of the sick, very primitive conditions. The hospital was not at all what it is now, and doctors really did a lot in their own office. Dad had two doctor bags. One was a surgical doctor bag, and one was a medical doctor bag. and depending on the need of the patient, he would be prepared to do what he could in the home, part of a calling. He did tell me that after 6 home deliveries, he gave up that concept entirely and asked for all women to make some arrangement to at least come to a hospital if they're going to deliver, because he was afraid of losing a baby, and he didn't want to do that. But the tradition was to do everything in the home. And Dad's book, The Stories of West Virginia Doctor, detailed that in great detail. Dad, after he retired and he's writing his memoir, appeared on our TV show, Tender Loving Care, some 52 times. And in that instance, I got 77 stories of his that he did not write down. It didn't quite meet his muster because he wanted a lot of medicine in each of the stories that he put in his book. But they're great stories, and they're all about calling again, his calling to practice medicine. Some of the stories, for example, that certainly Tender Loving Care to me, a home delivery where he went to see a woman. The house is just a shack. It's unheated. It's wintertime. It's raining through the roof. There's holes in the floorboards. The air can come up through, and she's dying and freezing, and he has a Army coat, a raincoat, good quality. The Army had good product for their soldiers in World War II, and he had retired after 8 years in service in the Army Air Corps. But he had his coat that night. He needed it, but he left it with that lady because she needed it more. And that's a caring story. May not have a lot of medicine in Dad's eyes, but it's a caring story. And then there's yet another book that we've written. These are all available at Artistry on Main, the local shop on Main Street across from the Dairy Queen. This time of the year is a great time to go there and stop in Artistry on Main, and these books are available there. But anyway, Dad and Mom raised us to love the hills of West Virginia and to be grounded. And I appreciate Helen Rigger, the first kindergarten teacher in West Virginia, who wrote the foreword to this book because she knew my parents from Wesleyan College days. And let me just read a line or two of what she said because I'm trying to wet your whistle about the idea of calling. She also is a person of calling to start a kindergarten in West Virginia. And of course, she was the Teacher of the Year recognized finally in 1976, but she began her kindergarten career in 1958. She says this is not just a treasure of memories, it's a portrait of family love, what my parents were trying to do with us, 5 kids. Children are immersed in a wealth of experiences filled with fun and laughter, while the parents capture teachable moments for history, geography, and science. Perhaps more importantly than the memories relayed by Dr. Almond, I'm the one writing the book in this case about my father and mother, they reflect a high regard of his parents that they placed on the aspirations for goals and high moral values, and I might say calling. Appreciation for truth and justice and respect for all, regardless of their walk in life, were qualities instilled by loving parents. And she goes on to say that parents and teachers and all who work with children need to model this type of behavior in a daily way. And I appreciate that Helen Rigger saying those things about my family, and that's included in that book. You get into writing things like this, and there's more stories that pop up. And so people began to tell me stories of my parents that I had never heard, not from them, and so we began to write those for kith and kin. My son Rance came up with that as a good Scottish term, and I've seen it in other places since then, but we entitled it Stories of a West Virginia Doctor for Kith and Kin. And different aspects of practicing medicine in the hills, that calling of medicine. And then we began to have grandchildren. I was 64 before I had my first granddaughter. We now have 4 little granddaughters, and we love them all. And so we captured stories for the granddaughters, and that's been fun. I convinced my sisters, and they really wanted to be convinced. It was not didn't twist their arm very much, but I have 4 sisters and myself. We wrote from 8 perspectives, or from eight different topics, from 5 perspectives about the same situation. How our parents raised us, taking hikes and making calls, country calls with Dad, family events around our home, Main Street, Buchanan, and various topics like that. So that turned out to be great storytelling endeavor too. But I want to say that just to say that I want this, by giving a topic like this, I want it to be aha, we can do that too. There are people out there who have their stories of their family. There's family reunions going on right now. I see the list in the paper every week. Where there's a granddad, a grandmother, great uncle, great aunt, someone who's going to pass away soon, at least turn on a tape recorder, a smartphone, record some of those stories that they're telling, and then consider writing them down for posterity. These are precious ways to get at the idea of calling. Young people desperately need to be directed and to have a sense of calling. Well, Paul writes about half the New Testament, his letters, and he's perhaps the greatest missionary that ever lived, and he makes his journeys with the idea that he may or may not live, but it's a matter of faith. And I'd like to open this thought about his calling, and he's called to be faithful from Acts 21, verse 12 and 13. We and local believers urged Paul, at this point he's away from Jerusalem, not to go up to Jerusalem. Paul said, "Why are you doing this? Why are you weeping and breaking my heart? I'm ready not only to be arrested, but even to die in Jerusalem for the sake of the name of the Lord Jesus." So he is responding to his calling, willing to put his name or his life on the line. I cannot say enough about my experiences with veterans. It's a whole, many programs I've devoted to this. But if you want to think about the definition of a veteran, it's exactly what Paul is saying here. In our society, there are very few people who actually will put their life on the line for another person. But the American veteran, the American soldier, is such a person. When they sign on to join the military for service, they are saying, I am willing to pay any price to serve my country, to serve my fellow man, up including death, willing to die for my country. And they join the service knowing that type of risk. And they serve with honor and with courage and run the race set before them. That's what calling is all about. And that's what Paul is talking about when he describes, he says, don't break my heart. I'm going to do what I'm going to do because I have a calling. He faced a lot of hardship. In 2 Corinthians, and my father's stories would outline the difficulties he faced in practicing medicine, but Paul in 2 Corinthians talks about his missionary journeys and the difficulties he faced. He said, I faced death many times. I received the 40 lashes minus 1 from Jews 5 times. Apparently that's a severe punishment, and I mean we've debated on our TV screens waterboarding and other tortures, but anyway, a punishment 40 lashes minus 1 was they had to only do 39 because if they did 40, apparently the person might die. So they right up to the almost killing a person, they would punish them, and he had that 5 times. He says. I was beaten with rods 3 times, and so some type of a pole or cane or something, severe beating. I was stoned once, Stoning, of course, could result in death. And I was shipwrecked 3 times. So as he traveled, it was not an easy journey. We complained about airport waits, and security checks and so forth. But traveling back in those days, he was shipwrecked 3 times. Each of those, he could have been killed. He spent a day and a night in the open sea. And I've been on many journeys, he says. I faced dangers from rivers and robbers, my people and Gentiles. I faced dangers in the city, in the desert, on the sea, and from false prophets or false brothers and sisters. I faced these dangers with hard work and heavy labor. And by the way, he didn't even draw a salary as a missionary. He was a tent maker, so he earned his own way as he was serving God. So he says, heavy labor, many sleepless nights. One time at the end of my father's career, we were adding up the deliveries that he did, and I think it was turned out to be 3,600, in that range. And you could just think about it, half of the deliveries would be in the daytime and half would be at night. So he had 1,600 deliveries. What do I want to say? 1,700 deliveries 1,800 deliveries that he delivered at night, and then you add those nights up and so forth. So my father was awake for 12 years of his professional career, and I can't even imagine that as someone who practiced psychiatry and would take call on occasion and have some sleepless times, but nothing like 12 years. That's a calling. And Paul's emphasizing that here, that he was up at night, many nights, many sleepless nights, he says. Hungry and thirsty, often without food, and in the cold without enough clothes. And then besides all of these things I could mention, there's my daily stress because I'm concerned about all the churches. And we have, thank goodness, we have the letters of Paul. He wrote back to the churches, and you can sense his concern for them. And so that's Paul's own litany of difficulties he had in 2 Corinthians. Paul's also running, in a sense, a betwixt and between condition. He's Jewish, but now he's called by Christ on Damascus Road experience to be a missionary to Gentiles, to the non-Jews, and so he's having to confront, in a sense, the leaders at Rome or in Jerusalem who want him to be sticking to the Jewish laws and then adding Christianity on top of it. But he's saying it's a matter of faith that we're saved and not by works, and he can't do that. And so he's betwixt and between all the time. And so he had to describe on one occasion how he addressed the question of the law and, of course, reaching the Gentiles who were not under the Jewish law. And I think this is admirable, but it's you might call it wishy-washy if you were a politician saying it today. But anyway, to the Jews I became as a Jew in order to win Jews. To those under the law I became as one under the law, though I myself am not under the law, so that I might win those under the law. To those outside the law I became as one outside the law, though I'm not free from God's law, but I am under Christ's law. And he considered that the new covenant. And then so that I might win those outside the law, and to the weak I became weak, and so that I might win the weak. I have become all things to all people, that I might by all means save some. So he was a very adaptable man and moved in and out of various circles. I had a privileged position as a Roman citizen in that culture. Similar to being an American citizen, I've had the pleasure to travel abroad, including like the Philippines, where my wife is from, and Americans are held in high esteem in other countries of the world. and not for what we personally have done, but the traditions of the American people. We have been givers. We have sent out more missionaries than any culture in the past. We have given beaucoup money to people, underdeveloped people, and of course we have American exceptionalism, and so that's all a part. And Paul had that same recognition as a Roman citizen in his time. Well, I want to inspire you, I think, to think about calling, and so 4 questions that you could address, and Adam Hamilton in this book called The Call comes up with this list, but I endorse it. I think it's a good way to look at this. In fact, if a person were beginning to write out their own testimony, which I think people should, they should have a 2-minute testimony, something about who they are in faith that only requires 2 minutes to talk about in case that's all the time a person has. Maybe a 5-minute testimony, and so they could elaborate further, and then maybe the equivalent of a sermon, which I think sermons should be under 20 minutes, so a 20-minute testimony. But people should write out and consider what God has done for them, how they've been transformed by their faith in Christ, and have it ready to tell to anyone. So here's 4 ways to do this. First, how and when did you become a Christian? This would be a simple question to answer. Could be elaborated on as I outlined. What led you to become a Christian? Again, the calling comes. How was that calling? And how have you experienced God working in your life? And I've encouraged people who've been a Christian for a long time to not go back and recite an example that happened, say, 20 years ago, but God is always working in our lives. My father, as he practiced medicine, would say that as we see a miracle of God every day when we practice medicine. And I'm sure that's true. I would echo his words. But how have you experienced God working in your life? You can come up with a current example of that. And then how has being a Christian positively changed your life? And I expect it would change your life. A funny thing, and brought a tear to my eye as I thought about it, but there's a funny aspect to it. The other day in Sunday school, I'm sitting next to Gary Summers. And Gary is a few years younger than me, but Ricky, his brother, was my age. And I became a Christian because Ricky had invited me to his farm the summer between the 4th and 5th grade out on Brushy Fork. And we were going to go camping and swimming and fishing and ride farm animals. I mean, we were looking forward to a great time. And about the time that was to happen, Ricky was making hay with his grandfather. And he fell off the hay wagon, but was a strong lad and held on and apparently got bumped along. And the grandfather apparently was hard of hearing, as I remember this. But he was, he didn't hear Ricky yelling out, and Ricky didn't let go. But so he got a head injury, and the head injury was severe, and he went into a coma, and he died. He never woke up. So that was my experience of losing my best friend in the 4th grade. And so, so then my mother had to talk to me about death and life after death and where's Ricky and so forth. And I made my vow to become a Christian. That, and then my father took me on a trip to Hemlock, house call, and very memorable. And so I have that as a part of my heritage, and certainly part of my story. Well, as we're sitting in Sunday school, Gary tells me, he says, tomorrow would be Ricky's day of death, 59 years ago. I thought, wow, a lifetime. That's amazing. But we have we could go back all that way, but there are funny things that happen after you become a Christian, and I remember that too. Not that I tried to be less of a boy and less of a character with my friends, but I noticed that people would somehow treat me differently. They didn't want to tell a raunchy story around me. They thought because Greenbrier wouldn't like to hear that kind of raunchy story. I didn't make it an announcement, but I noticed that even as I was in Boy Scouts and Boy Scout camping and things like that. So being a Christian has a positive influence on us from the very beginning. I want to say that about that fourth aspect of writing out your story. And I want you to be encouraged to do that. Well, there's always a final story, a final journey. And I remember we visited Reagan's ranch and his library this year when we were in California. We went to a medical meeting, and I'd been there before, but I'm moved by it every time. And I saw once again the letter that President Reagan wrote to the nation when he was told he had Alzheimer's disease. And he talked about the final journey, that he was going on a journey, and this was apparently his last public communication. He and Nancy then became more private, and of course he began to lose his memory, and what a great president, but what a journey he led us through as president. But he had his final journey. Well, Paul wants to make his journey to Rome. He's a Roman citizen. He wants to influence the Roman people, and he makes that journey. And so it's a harrowing journey, as many of them are. Paul is taken across the sea as a prisoner, and they're supposed to winter on the Isle of Crete. It takes at least a month to get to Rome from Jerusalem, some 2,000 miles, but it takes 6 months in this case, and the storms are horrible, and the ship is blown hundreds of miles off course. And so Paul, and he must be an obnoxious guy, so determined, but he writes, or Luke records, he says to the people on the ship, 276 of them, "Men, you should have listened to me and not have set sail from Crete, and therefore avoided this damage and loss. I urge you now to keep up your courage, for there will be no loss of life among you, but only of the ship." So how did he know that? Well, it's a matter of faith here, and the faith journey is what I want to talk about, what I want you to remember from this program. He says, "For last night there stood by me an angel of God, to whom I belong and whom I worship. And he said, 'Do not be afraid, Paul. You must stand before the emperor. And indeed, God has granted safety to all those who are sailing with you. So keep up your courage, men, for I have faith in God that it will be exactly as I have been told. But we will have to run aground on some island.'" So there's Paul, not alone. He's not traveling alone, is he? And some of you all have told me over the summer, I'm alone. I don't have a purpose. I'm lacking something. But that's not necessary, because God is with us all the time. Here Paul is telling 276 people, we're going to lose the ship, we're going to lose everything, but you're not going to lose your life. God has told me. And and Paul is a person of faith and holds on to that. Otherwise, how could he make it on such a journey? Well, there's much more we could talk about. I hope that you would continue to, if you want to continue this book, The Call, that you would get a copy of it. Adam Hamilton, I'm sure you can order it on Amazon or Barnes & Noble. Adam Hamilton's a pastor out in the Midwest, and The Call is about the Apostle Paul and his life and journeys. Or just go to your Bible and read the stories of Paul, the journeys of Paul. They're outlined in the back of most Bibles, and the greatest missionary ever, I can say without qualification, and and very inspiring. Until the next time, this is Dr. Greenbrier Allman thanking you for joining us on our program, Tender Loving Care. Special thanks to Channel 3 for the opportunity to come your way each week. Look forward to seeing you as we talk about other issues of tender, loving care.
Stories of a West Virginia Doctor, written by Dr. Harold D. Allman. A collection of 55 short stories about his experience as a small-town doctor in central West Virginia. And Tender Loving Care, Stories from a West Virginia Doctor, Volume 2, written by Dr. Greenbrier Allman, using videotapes to write 70 additional stories of his father's very colorful life as a small-town doctor. They can be found for purchase at Amazon.com and most local bookstores. Tune into Channel 3 Buckhannon for Tender Loving Care with Dr. Greenbrier Allman, where he talks about the connection between Christianity and medicine.